Hello, everybody. This is a program on constitutional government at Harvard. I'm Harvey Mansfield, and our guest today is Diana Schaub. Diana Schaub is a professor of political science at Loyola University in Baltimore, and she is an expert on she is an expert on Montesquieu, having written a book on the Persian letters called Erotic Liberalism, and many other articles on Montesquieu, the famous liberal philosopher. She's also written a book with Leon Cass, What So Proudly We Hail. And she has now just come out with a book on Abraham Lincoln, his greatest speeches, How Lincoln Moved a Nation. She's a graduate of Kenyon College and a PhD at the University of Chicago. And she's written many articles on African-American political thought, Frederick Douglass and others, and given a course here at Harvard on that subject. But she's also, I'm very interested in American political thought as a whole, and she's written this book on Lincoln. So Diana.
Thank you, Harvey. All right. I am delighted to be here. And the new book provides a close reading of 3 Lincoln speeches. I know that our time is limited, but I do believe in slow reading. So I thought I would limit my remarks to Lincoln's second inaugural. It would help a great deal if each of you has access to the speech and can follow along with my commentary. I'm hoping actually that you had the good fortune to have committed it to memory as a youngster, but if not, there is a link in the chat that will take you to the National Park Service version of the speech. Let's skip to the end and go directly to the final paragraph of the speech. There you will find its best known passage. Lincoln calls for citizens to act with malice toward none, with charity for all. Yet before charity could be possible, Lincoln believed that it was necessary for Americans to understand what had happened to the nation.
Keep the video off as long as you're here.
Paul, we need you to mute yourself. So Lincoln believed that the Americans had to understand what had happened to the nation. Reconciliation would require truth-telling and an inquiry into the cause and purpose of the war. Thus, in the second inaugural, what Lincoln does is to revisit the conflict. He revisits both its outbreak in 1861 and its ultimate origin in 1619. He offers an interpretation of the Civil War that, if accepted by all, would unite whites, North and South, in humility before God's judgment upon American slavery, and that would, in consequence, create the civic space in which Blacks could unite with whites under the same flag as neighborly citizens of a common country. Despite its large aims, Lincoln's second inaugural is among the shortest of inaugural addresses. Only Washington's second inaugural and Roosevelt's fourth are shorter. Although Lincoln begins, as was usual, with a reference to the taking of the oath of office, after that, he doesn't do any of the usual things. He doesn't express gratitude to the people for his reelection. He doesn't offer a review of the policy successes of the first term. He doesn't sketch out his plans for the second term. Second inaugurals usually have a sort of bullet point, here's what we did, here's what we're going to do structure. Of course, there was nothing usual about a national election in time of civil war. I remember only 25 of the 36 states participated in that election. The other 11 states still considering themselves to be a separate nation. Another feature that characterizes inaugural addresses is that they try to achieve a reunification of the nation after the intense partisanship of an electoral contest. Think about Thomas Jefferson, that highly contentious election in 1800. He promises to be president of all the people by announcing, "We are all Republicans, we are all Federalists." For Lincoln, however, the task of reunification was more difficult. It extended well beyond the parties to the election. it had to include the parties to the war. So one of the first rhetorical techniques that Lincoln adopts is to submerge himself. Again, this is very rare in inaugural addresses. Presidents usually say "I" a lot in these addresses, and they do so even if they are not clinical narcissists. Lincoln, though, makes only one reference to himself, and that is in this very little parenthetical aside that you can see toward the end of the first paragraph. Now, given that the occasion was Lincoln's own inauguration, his studied avoidance of self-reference is difficult to pull off. Indeed, the attempt to sink himself from view leads him into a rare grammatical error. If you take a look at the last sentence of the first paragraph, Lincoln is speaking about the progress of Union arms, and he says, "With high hope for the future, no prediction in regard to it is ventured." That is a dangling modifier. As written, the subject of the sentence is no prediction, and no prediction is not an entity capable of having high hopes. Fixing the sentence would require Lincoln to center himself in the sentence. He would have to say something like, "With high hope for the future, I venture no prediction in regard to it." So despite being center stage, Lincoln refuses the limelight. So we might ask, what replaces I as the operative actor? Well, politicians often substitute we. They focus on the collective. Lincoln had done that brilliantly in the Gettysburg Address, where he also caused himself to disappear completely. In the 271 words of the Gettysburg Address, there are 10 instances of we and not a single reference to I. Although Lincoln does make some use of we in the second inaugural, he relies much more on the indefinite pronoun all. All is far and away the most frequently used word in the second inaugural. It appears 10 times. All always refers to some whole quantity, whether of persons or things. The second inaugural is a speech about the whole, about how to put the whole population of a badly fractured country together. In the second inaugural, Lincoln is setting about to discover or construct an all out of discordant parts, including not only the parties to the war, but also the newly freed 1/8 of the whole population, to which he refers at the start of the third paragraph. These, of course, are the 4 million former slaves whose status will have to be clarified. Will they be fellow citizens? Will they be fellow voters? Will they be neighbors, friends, spouses? Lincoln must acknowledge the existence of these heterogeneous parts without deepening the divisions. Now, I think that every word, sentence, and paragraph of the speech is worthy of close attention, but since we don't have much time, I'm going to give a super quick overview of the first half of the speech, and then I'm going to skip directly to the crucial third paragraph. The first paragraph is mostly about why Lincoln is going to deliver such a brief address, why extensive speech is less called for now than at the time of the first inaugural. So the speech is actually toggling back and forth between 1865 and 1861, between then and now. Starting from the present, Lincoln will act as an archaeologist of the war. He's going to uncover first the surface layers of the war and then later the deeper deposits, the cause, the hidden but central purpose. The second paragraph whisks us back from March 4, 1865 to March 4, 1861, the day of Lincoln's first inaugural, and it explains the outbreak of the war. A few points emerge. First, no one wanted war. Second, the war was over the Union, whether it should be destroyed or saved. Third, although no one wanted war, it was nonetheless the consequence of human choices. One party was prepared to make war, the other was prepared to accept war. In other words, each had something in view that it regarded as more important than war, something important enough to justify war. Fourth, war was a consequence, a logical result, not a happenstance or a mistake. Many scholars are struck by the moral even-handedness of Lincoln's presentation, and I do think there's something to the observation, but I think it's often exaggerated. And Lincoln's reliance on these indefinite pronouns, not only all, but both, each, neither, that generates this impression of impartiality or equivalence. However, there is an undeniable moral judgment expressed toward the parties. The insurgents, and that word itself has a negative connotation, they have set their faces against the nation's survival. They're actively seeking to destroy it. The other side, the government, refuses to allow the nation to perish and is devoted altogether to saving the Union. Despite that sharp discrimination, Lincoln does not place sole blame for the war on the insurgents. Right? They were not belligerents, they were insurgents. It took both parties acting as they did for the reasons they did to produce the war that neither wanted. And the war came, Lincoln says. It's the shortest sentence in the address. So paragraph 2 has explained the outbreak of the war, but it did not get to the cause. That deeper matter of causation is the topic to which Lincoln turns in the third paragraph. Third paragraph begins with a part of the whole not yet mentioned. 1/8 of the whole population were colored slaves, not distributed generally over the Union, but localized in the southern part of it. Lincoln highlights various features of this portion of the population: their number, their color, their condition, and their location are each important. But perhaps most important is simply the description of these persons as belonging to the whole. Lincoln speaks of slaves, not slavery. He focuses on real human beings rather than an institution. Not being free citizens, these colored slaves have no say in their location. They are distributed rather than having chosen to live or reside somewhere. Lincoln's phrasing is very careful here. Note that he doesn't speak of the South. He speaks instead of the southern part of the Union. Over the course of the war, it would have been easy to slip into regarding the North as somehow synonymous with the Union. Lincoln rejects that identification. The Union is the whole, and the residents of this southern part, whether they be colored slaves or white citizens, are part of the whole. Lincoln's description also indicates that slavery and color are entwined with one another. Not all colored people are enslaved, but all slaves are colored or regarded as colored. Significantly, however, Lincoln does not use the word race. And if you look at his speeches through the 1850s, I think it shows that he generally avoided the term. By contrast, the defenders of slavery routinely identified slaves as belonging to the African race. That race language suggests the existence of essentially different categories, and certainly when it's in the mouth of white supremacists, it carries an implication of race-based hierarchy. Lincoln's preferred language of color marks a visible difference, but one that is only skin deep and is moreover arrayed across a spectrum. Nonetheless, the fact that condition and color are linked makes this demographic stand out. It is a distinct and identifiable minority within the whole. So, slaves comprise an anomalous part. The next sentence provides further definition. These slaves constituted a peculiar and powerful interest. Of course, that word peculiar had long been peculiarly associated with slavery. It's a coinage traceable to John C. Calhoun. Slavery was called the South's peculiar institution, a euphemism that was meant to convey Southern specialness, but that was also adopted with very heavy sarcasm by slavery's opponents. So Frederick Douglass, for instance, the nation's most famous runaway slave, was often introduced as, quote, a graduate from the peculiar institution with his diploma written on his back. Lincoln has so far avoided using the word slavery, or the word institution. Instead, he speaks of these slaves as a peculiar interest. I think that the formulation captures the essence of enslavement. Human beings have become a commodity in which other human beings hold an economic interest. Without naming the commodifiers, the oligarchic few who were the slave owners and the slave dealers, Lincoln is penetrating to the motive behind the peculiar institution. After more accurately characterizing slave ownership as an interest rather than an institution, and thereby reminding us of Madison's observation in Federalist 10 that interests are powerful drivers of political faction, Lincoln declares all knew that this interest was somehow the cause of the war. The statement is unequivocal, all knew, which is to say both those who shared the interest and those who did not were aware that this interest was the cause of the war. Although the cause was known to all, the operation of the cause is unspecific. This interest was somehow the cause of the war. The next sentence gives some detail about that somehow, for it moves from the all, which is the point of agreement, to a specification of the divergent aims of the parties, and especially the scope of those aims. Passage here. To strengthen, perpetuate, and extend this interest was the object for which the insurgents would rend the Union, even by war, while the government claimed no right to do more than to restrict the territorial enlargement of it. Lincoln now clearly denominates the parties as the insurgents and the government. What was at issue between them was whether this interest, the economic system based on property and man, whether that would spread and thereby become perpetual, or whether it would be confined to its existing localization. Although divided over this interest, the parties were in many ways the same. For instance, they had the same mistaken expectation that the war would be quick and easy. Even though they knew that slavery was the cause of the war, they did not anticipate that the war would bring about an end to slavery. A note here about the structure of the speech. The most obvious dividing line is the third paragraph's shortest sentence. The Almighty has his own purposes. That sentence serves as a kind of fulcrum. It's the point at which the causal analysis shifts from a purely human, kind of rationally calculative perspective to a viewpoint under the aspect of eternity. However, it might be just as defensible to split the paragraph 3 sentences earlier. That is the moment at which religion is first introduced into the speech. Lincoln points out that both read the same Bible and pray to the same God, and each invokes his aid against the other. Religion appears on the scene because of the human behavior that seeks to muster God militarily. Another indication, I think, of the significance of this moment is that the verb tense dramatically shifts from the past to the present tense. If you just take a look at the lines that precede that line that I just quoted, you see they're in the past tense. Neither party expected, neither anticipated that, each looked for. And so you might expect him to continue, both read the same Bible and prayed to the same God. Instead, he says both read the same Bible and pray to the same God. And actually, when you look at the speech in print, you're not actually aware of the shift in verb tense until you get to the verb pray, because the present and past of read happen to be heteronyms. They're spelled the same, but pronounced differently. You might even say that the two parties to the war are like heteronyms. They're similar in some respects and different in others. When these two parties then find that their expectations and calculations are foiled, both turn towards divine assistance. They turn to the identical Bible, the identical God, even the identical prayer. This religious commonality, the bond of shared Christian belief, was weaponized equally by both parties to the war. In other words, they deployed religion divisively, attempting to claim God for their own side. Now, from this point forward, which is the halfway point of the speech, religion will be the main topic. This same God will be invoked a total of 14 times over the next 9 sentences. Starting from the conflictual way that religious appeals have figured in the war, Lincoln will try to reverse this. He does so not by insisting on a separation of religion and politics, which is the route that one might take today. Instead, I think he does it by doing religion differently. But before he can get to that, I think what he does is to, in a certain way, imitate the religious crusaders. And Lincoln's own impartiality sort of breaks down in the next sentence, and he bursts out. It may seem strange that any man should dare to ask a just God's assistance in wringing their bread from the sweat of other men's faces. After so strongly expressing his conviction that slavery is at odds with God's justice, Lincoln then pulls back from his assignment of moral blame, and he quotes another Bible verse, "Let us judge not that we be not judged." He puts these two opposing thoughts, both of them drawn directly from the Bible, one from the Old Testament, the other from the New Testament. He puts them into one sentence, juxtaposing them. God is anti-slavery, but God also warns against judging others. Human beings have to be aware of and beware of hypocrisy. All are sinners and guilty. So Lincoln is administering a check to self-righteousness, and especially the self-righteousness of those on the anti-slavery side, those on his side. And in fact, this is his first use of the words us and we, and they entail a correction of his own side in the struggle. Lincoln then returns to the fact that both sides pray. He isn't any longer going to disparage the content of another person's prayers. Nonetheless, since prayers are addressed to a higher power, perhaps we can conclude something about God's judgment from God's answers to prayer. Lincoln presents a logical analysis. Since the prayers of the two parties are diametrically opposed, the prayers of both could not be answered. God himself is bound by the principle of non-contradiction. Then Lincoln says that of neither has been answered fully. Now, this is curious, since one of the logical possibilities is that God favored one side's prayers over the other, as God did in that original fratricidal conflict between Cain and Abel, where Abel's offering saw favor and Cain's did not. In other words, isn't the progress of Union arms, which Lincoln had mentioned in that opening paragraph, isn't that a sign that God is on the Union side? But Lincoln leaves out that possibility, or he sort of suppresses that possibility. He doesn't make the usual triumphalist move. And this, in fact, was the move that was being made by religious leaders throughout the North. Instead, he administers another check to moral superiority, and he says modestly that the prayer of neither side has been answered fully. Now, that's certainly true of the insurgents. They can't be very impressed with the efficacy of prayer at this point in the war. Lincoln's phrasing covers over the significant gap between the outcome for the two parties. The Union may not have gotten all it wanted, but it is on the cusp of winning. But Lincoln's formulation draws attention away from
it. Sit closer. Can you hear it clearly? No.
Need everybody to mute. Thank you. So instead, what Lincoln does is to emphasize the commonality of the disappointed prayers, years worth of them, as the war dragged on, and hundreds of thousands of young men died. So this leads to that powerful pivot moment in the speech. The Almighty has his own purposes. Lincoln suggests that God's purposes were for a long time mysterious. But he also suggests that the terrible and protracted course of the war and its fundamental and astounding result must be part of God's purposes. The purposes have disclosed themselves over time and through our mutual suffering, through that woe that we have undergone. And Lincoln now quotes directly another Bible verse, Matthew 18:7, about sin, its inevitability, and God's punishment of it. So he's arrived at the point toward which the argument has been aiming. In the longest sentence of the speech, he presents a theological interpretation of the meaning of the war. He interprets it as the blood price that the nation must pay for the sin of slavery. Now, note that he does not present this interpretation as certain knowledge. It is a supposition, if we shall suppose that. So it's a hypothesis, and it's offered as such. I think that diffidence with which he offers it and the complexity of the sentence itself drains away any of that religious fanaticism that worries him about when religion seeps into politics. So it's very true that Lincoln is using religion for political purposes, but he's using religion to encourage humility rather than pridefulness. Another thing to note is that he finally uses the word slavery. He's been holding off on using this until this moment, and it is not Southern slavery, it's not African slavery, it is American slavery, and both words are capitalized. The offense of slavery belongs to the nation as a whole, and thus the punishment of the war applies to both North and South. All white Americans have been complicit in slavery. Even those who opposed slavery could be said to have benefited from it. All Americans wore cotton and they all consumed sugar. In a way, I think that Lincoln is describing what we now call white privilege. It's the unmerited status and advantages that accrue based on the possession of white skin and based on the oppression of those of another skin color. So Lincoln has framed his suggestion that the nation is being punished for the sin of slavery as a hypothesis, and then he follows up in that very same sentence with a question. If this supposition of God punishing the nation is true, then would, quote, we discern therein a departure from those divine attributes which the believers in a living God always ascribe to him? I think the implied answer is no. A God who acts in this way would, in fact, be a just God. Lincoln now interrupts his account of God's possible purposes to express our human reaction to the punishment. We hope and pray for it to cease. The sentence rhymes, and I think it partly serves as a breather between the two sentences that flank it. Both of the flanking sentences are very complex as sentences and very painful in content. Remember that when Lincoln mentioned the prayers earlier, the two sides were praying for military victory against the other. But now the nature of the prayers has changed, and he has them jointly praying for the war to end. Just as the earlier prayers were not fully answered, this one might not be either. God's will is what will prevail. And Lincoln formulates another final hypothetical about God's will. Yet, if God wills that it continue until all the wealth piled by the bondman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another, drawn with the sword, as was said 3,000 years ago, so still it must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. I think this is the most remarkable sentence of all. Lincoln takes us back to the origin date of slavery in the Western Hemisphere. If you do the math here, if you subtract 250 from 1865, you get 1615. So Lincoln is giving the approximate date, and it is not far off the actual date of 1619. So if you remember what the Gettysburg Address had done, it had traced the birth of the United States in 1776. But the second inaugural singles out 1619 as the date of America's original sin. In effect, the nation has been engaged in a war that pits the spirit of 1776 against the spirit of 1619. And not only that, but Lincoln says that if God wanted to exact full justice, dollar for dollar, blood for blood, the war might continue much longer. Divine reparations would exact much more than any of our current notions about reparations. Now, the most important question, what does this theological interpretation achieve? I believe that what it does is make possible the final paragraph of the speech. If Americans will join Lincoln in understanding the war in this way, then space will be cleared for human charity, or at least a lessening of human malice. So the theological interpretation has a political purpose. It is to gentle the mindset of his fellow citizens and prepare them for the difficult work of Reconstruction ahead. I want to say something just a little bit more about how I think this specifically functions for the various parties concerned. How does the invocation of 1619 help to unite the discordant parts of the nation? By emphasizing shared national suffering as a consequence of shared national transgression, Lincoln is certainly seeking to check the moral preening of the Northerners and to lessen their prosecutorial zeal. Remember, radical Republicans like Thaddeus Stevens very much blamed the South for the war, and they wanted the South to pay. Stevens thought that the Southern states should actually be stripped of statehood, reduced to territorial status, and as he said, made to eat the fruit of foul rebellion for a generation or more. At the same time, by nationalizing or desectionalizing the blame for slavery, I think Lincoln is doing what he can, and maybe he can't do much, but he's doing what he can to help Southerners join in admitting the error of their ways. So this is more than a display of magnanimity towards the defeated. I don't think the speech is actually an instance of magnanimity. He's not assuming the stance of a generous victor. He's doing something more radical. He's refusing to call the result a victory for the Union. The emphasis is instead on shared national transgression in order to encourage this humility and repentance. Then we might ask, what consolation and promise does this interpretation hold for Blacks? Well, whites have been emphatically told that God was all along on the side of the bondsman. Blacks, I think, are encouraged to believe that the long delay in vindicating them was also somehow part of divine providence. Further, the President of the United States has now officially declared that God would be justified were he to exact eye for eye vengeance on their behalf. This national confession of guilt does not do away with the need for political justice going forward, but the thought that Americans have been punished, really punished. One soldier died for every 7 persons enslaved from 1619 until 1865. That thought might incline these new Black citizens toward a stance of thanksgiving for their blood-bought freedom and patience for the struggles ahead. And one hint that Lincoln's message to the Black population was understood can be seen in the fact that in every post-war speech in which Frederick Douglass mentioned Lincoln, he always quoted this divine reparations passage from the second inaugural. Then one final point, if full justice was not demanded by God, if God was merciful to the nation, stopping short of the full blood sacrifice, then all Americans might be willing to imitate that generosity in their treatment of one another. Lincoln's spiritualized understanding of the war was designed to help the various parts of the American whole to rise above their worst passions, arrogance, vindictiveness, resentment, hatred, rage, clearing the way for genuine atonement with the hope that all could be encompassed within newly forged bonds of civic affection. Now, we know that the assassination of Lincoln deprived the American people of the statesman best equipped to follow his own advice. How much difference it would have made is impossible to know. Yet for us today, I think the most important thing is that the words and example of Lincoln remain. He still communicates his thoughts to us, and we in turn can converse with him. His spirit abides. If we listen and reflect, all may yet be well for the divided America of our day. All right, let me stop there and open up to questions. Yeah, Peter?
Thanks, Diana. That was great. Speaking of reparations, with the benefit of hindsight, do you think more should have been done for the former slaves in 1865? In particular, would it have been fitting? Would it have been possible to confiscate at least large estates of former insurgents, divide and distribute them as reparation for former slaves? And of course, I asked partly with an eye to the current debate about reparations. On the one hand, seems like a very questionable, dubious idea 150 years later. On the other hand, can one deny some justice to the claim that, not enough was done?
Yeah. Alan Gelso has a nice little book on Reconstruction, and he talks about the dilemma that the Republicans faced. So while there was, some interest in doing something like that, at the same time, Republicans believed strongly in the right of property. Even though you could say that what had taken hold in the South, for the previous few decades was really a very narrow oligarchy, and an oligarchy that was in process of becoming even more restrictive, including, beginning to exclude large numbers of poor whites, excluding them from education, excluding them from the franchise. So you really did have the problem of, how could you bring about a regime change in the southern states as they were brought back into the Union. So I think it was very much a dilemma and a dilemma in principle. And Gelso talks about that. I certainly agree that land reform or something like that would certainly have been, reparations would have made some sense for those directly affected. It becomes almost impossible to figure out how you could do this, at our point in time. Yeah, but I would recommend that that little book by Gelso. He sort of sketches the difficulties of Reconstruction. Lorraine, I think I saw your hand first, maybe.
Yeah, thanks, Diana. All very interesting. So I was just wondering if you had any further thoughts on the very striking contrast between Lincoln's own extremely gentle, non-retributive spirit and the very harsh retribution that he's at least willing to attribute provisionally to God, and where that tension might be going, where he might be trying to push American religion in that respect.
You could say that one thing that he's doing, he is sort of shifting the blame to God. He's making him responsible, for all of this woe. And in a certain way, he is doing that. But he has also made clear that that those by whom the offense came are being held responsible for the woe. So it's not so much maybe that he's shifting the blame to God. He's just trying to generalize the blame to the nation and trying to get the nation to own up to that. I mean, I do think that he is very much engaged here in a conversation with the pulpits in both the North and the South, and that he is in a way trying to correct the way in which religion was used during the war and the way it is being used, at the end of the war. I don't know if that's a sufficient answer. Do you want to come back and press me a little further on it?
No, I don't have any further thoughts myself. I'm just struck by the contrast.
Yeah.
Thanks.
David?
Hi, and thank you very much. I had two questions. One is when he says the prayers of both could not be answered, that of neither has been answered fully. He seems to go out of his way to say that each side only has one prayer rather than, continuing with the plural. And I wondered what you make of that. I mean, does each side only pray for victory? It seems like they would pray for more. The other question is whether in saying those divine attributes which the believers in a living God always ascribe to him, Lincoln seems to me to be quite explicitly distancing himself from this view. And I wonder if that's entirely prudent, but also whether, he really is telling us, I'm not buying any of this theological stuff myself. This is just for you.
Yeah, good. Two different questions there. The one about the prayers, excellent attention to the text when he's using the singular and when he's using the plural. I do think his suggestion has been that the prayer of each side was identical, the same. They were praying for victory, right? Each invokes his aid against the other. So that was the same prayer, that same oppositional prayer that was being used by the two sides. And so I think that's what he means when he says that prayer has not been fully answered. But I do think that there is, as I tried to sketch, this interesting shift in the content of the prayer. So that he eventually arrives at the point where both sides are not praying the same thing in an oppositional way, but praying the same thing in a way that indicates repentance, praying for it to end, praying for it to pass. And then the interesting formulation, the attributes that the believers in a living God always ascribe to him. I think you're right that there is that distancing. It's of course true that this is just very characteristic of all of Lincoln's speeches, this ability to distance himself and take himself out of it. So it's not as if this is unique to when he is only speaking about religious matters. Nonetheless, you're absolutely right. He doesn't say that he is one of those believers. And there are people who read the use of religion here as, purely political expedience. He's speaking to a largely Christian people. This is a type of argument that might carry some weight with them. And that there are other ways in which it's distanced also. The fact that it's just put forward as a hypothesis. So there are all kinds of elements of distancing here. And I think it's a plausible way to read the speech. But I also think that there is other evidence of growing religiosity on Lincoln's part. And it's also true that there is another moment here in the speech where he doesn't do any distancing. That divine reparations passage, he says, if God had the war continue until the full blood price was paid, then as was said 3 years ago, so still it must be said. The judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. So that his voice does seem to be included in that statement in a way that the believers in the living God, you could exclude him from that passage. I want to be sure to take other questions, but if there isn't one right now, I think there is another passage that bears on this question that we could maybe take a look at. This is a letter that Lincoln wrote. I think I printed it out. Let me see if I can find it here. Maybe I can't find it. I can probably do it from memory, though. A letter that Thurlow Weed writes to Lincoln after the second inaugural, and he praises him for the speech. And Lincoln writes back and he says, you know, everybody likes a compliment. I thank you for yours. And then he gives his own reflection on the second inaugural. And he says that I think the speech will wear as well as anything I have yet produced, but I don't think it is immediately popular. So that's interesting. It indicates, I think, that Lincoln thought the second inaugural was his best, and that it would be his most lasting speech. It will wear as well as anything I have produced, but it's not immediately popular. And then he goes on to explain why it's not immediately popular. He says, people don't like to be told that there's been a difference between themselves and the Almighty. But he says, it was a truth that I thought needed to be told. And as whatever of humiliation there is in it falls primarily upon myself, I thought that others might afford for me to tell it. So that's interesting, to think of the second inaugural as somehow involving Lincoln's humiliation. In what sense does the speech involve his humiliation? I think that's worth thinking about. You know, one way in which it involves his humiliation is that he is humbling himself. He's not taking any credit for the war, for the outcome of the war, for the victory. He is also in a way admitting that what he thought the war was about, namely the Union, is not apparently what it was actually about, at least not what it was about for God, from God's perspective. From God's perspective, it was about punishing the nation and bringing about emancipation, whereas Lincoln had always subordinated the cause of abolition, the cause of emancipation, to the Union, and he had done so in accord with his understanding of the oath of office, and what it meant to be elected president of the United States. His obligation was to the Union. He only brings about emancipation when he thinks it is the only way to save the Union. But the second inaugural sets all of that reasoning aside and no longer insists on that. So the speech is very, very different from the Gettysburg Address. So that's one thing we might say about in what way is the speech Lincoln's humiliation specifically. Jean. Well, you're on mute.
That was a really lovely presentation. I'm wondering if I could ask you a much more historical question. Sure. And it's also a hypothetical. But how successful do you think Lincoln would have been had he not been assassinated in bringing about a different form of reconciliation than the one the radical Republicans imposed?
Yeah,
I know
that's just very tough to know. I mean, he was so aware of the obstacles to successful reconciliation, and I think this speech indicates how aware he was of it. I mean, it's why he doesn't simply sketch his plans for reconstruction in the speech. That's what people expected him to do. But I think he believes that there is a work of preparation first before you can even get to that. And this speech is that work of preparation. In other words, he is first attentive to the problem of public opinion and the need to reshape public opinion if there's going to be any hope for Reconstruction. Now, I mean, that said, I mean, I think he certainly would have been better than Johnson, President Johnson, and I think he would have done much to set the proper tone for Reconstruction, so that he might have pressed for some of the same policies as the radical Republicans, but the tone with which he did it would have been very different. He probably also would have gone much slower in including Blacks into the polity. I mean, I believe you can see as early as Peoria that Lincoln understands that the principles of our regime require full political equality for Blacks. In Peoria, he says, allow all, puts in all caps, all, allow all the governed a voice in government, and that only is self-government. That means the franchise for Blacks, for women. And of course, at the time of Peoria, he has to immediately sort of pull back from that and say, no, don't think that I'm, immediately introducing this. But he has already made clear what the terminus has to be. But you can see in that last public speech that he delivers just 5 days before his assassination, he is starting to work towards that, but he's doing so in a very incremental fashion. So he calls for a limited franchise in Louisiana. He says for those who have fought for the Union, those Black soldiers who fought for the Union, and the intelligent, the very intelligent, which I assume might have meant something like a literacy test for the franchise. So he's moving in that direction. He's trying to ready public opinion to accept that. He also mentions public schooling, equal public schooling, another element of what should happen in Louisiana. But he's going slowly. So, what he would have said about the 15th Amendment would be, I think, an interesting question. We could look maybe at Booker T. Washington to see what he might have thought about the 15th Amendment. And Booker T. Washington is critical of Frederick Douglass for having pushed too quickly on full political inclusion. Washington's view was that the work that had to be done was economic work and educational work, that kind of uplift. And that once that were done, it would be easier for white Americans to accept Black political inclusion. So Washington thought that push for the 15th Amendment was bound to generate backlash. Douglass, I think, believed that, he said as much. He said that with the conclusion of the war and with the assassination of Lincoln, that the nation was prepared to learn righteousness, and that it was the window of opportunity to push to get that into the Constitution. So Douglass, as much as as Lincoln or Washington, knew that it wasn't going to be enforced. I think he knew that even if it existed for a decade, it would then be whittled away and abrogated in this. But Douglass thought it was absolutely important to get those words in the Constitution, because the Constitution is this great liberty document that serves as a weapon for the future. So I think there's a really interesting debate, as to whether that was a good idea or not. But Lincoln might have encouraged more caution about that. And concentrated on these other elements, the economics and literacy.
Yeah, I'm just, if I could just make a brief comment. I'm reading your book, and I'm just struck by your comment that Lincoln devoted himself in those years of the crisis to trying to change public opinion, and then your comment, but he failed.
Yeah, that's one of the interesting things about Lincoln. Almost every speech he ever gives is a failure to achieve what he calls for. He held us to high standards, and we usually don't meet them. Yeah, Paul.
So that was a terrific presentation. I learned so much from what you had to say. so informative on so many dimensions. And your last set of comments about Lincoln himself expressing humility, maybe I was wrong, or maybe I was not in touch with the true will of the Almighty. You know, he said the war was fought for the Union, and he always justified that because the United States was the hope for the world. It would save the world, or somehow we had to save the Union in order to save democracy or some ideal. And he seems now to be backing away from that, or at least your observations make me think that he's doing that. And when I think about, you know, there's an alternative scenario out there. Did we really need a war? You know, the South secedes, and he provokes a war by sending supplies to Fort Sumter, and he's willing to accept the war. So, and accepts it for this larger purpose, which he may, but if you think about it, why wouldn't we think that slavery would just sort of soon disappear anyhow? It's disappearing around the world. We're maybe lagging behind, but you can contain slavery simply by letting the South secede and preventing it from spreading. So a lot of what he said about slavery as he was running for president didn't require that he go to war. He can contain the spread of this disease. So is he actually beginning to wonder whether he really should have done this?
Yeah, well, there's an awful lot there and an awful lot there that I think I disagree with, Paul. So this might take me a little while. Yeah, I mean, I did want to indicate that Lincoln is humble in the sense that he's acknowledging that something larger might have been operative. But I don't think that entails any revision of how he had to act in accord with his morality and his duty. In other words, it would not in any way have changed his oath and the meaning of his oath. He was required to maintain the Union. So I don't think anything changes there. You mentioned, I think you used the word provoke, that he might have provoked the war. I guess I disagree with that. It's certainly not the way he presents it in the second inaugural. The humanitarian relief of Fort Sumter was explicitly designed not to be provocative. Right? That's what they were doing, not bringing in additional forces or additional weaponry, but simply providing food and water to the men at Sumter. But then the bigger issue, I think, is what you say about slavery. Was it on its way out? Lincoln's understanding is that what the South has in mind is the creation of a vast slave empire. They want that territory, the U.S. territory to the west, to spread slavery. And they are already talking, there's already talk about the reinstitution of the international slave trade. Of course, there'd always been some smuggling going on, but it was officially outlawed. But if you say that, slavery is not a moral matter, as Stephen Douglass says, if we're just indifferent towards it, then there's no way to oppose the reinstitution of the international slave trade. The southern states are also looking at the acquisition of new territories at Cuba, at regions, at more of Mexico or areas in South America. So I don't think it's clear that slavery is on its way out at all. In fact, Lincoln believes that the nation is at a kind of tipping point, at regression. That's what we're looking at. That's why he's so emphatic on, resisting the spread of slavery. So I think he believes that the only way that slavery could be on its way out is if you reinstitute that moral and physical quarantine in which slavery was put at the time of the founding. That you brand it as an evil. All public policy must proceed with the understanding that it is an evil, even while observing the constitutional bargain that slavery gets to continue in the slave states until they themselves voluntarily do away with it.
Well, I don't disagree with anything you have said there, but the South did not have the power to carry out those grand schemes once it seceded from the Union, and it is now going to be this group of fairly, small number of states with limited power. They're going to have to deal with, a much stronger political economy to the north of them. The idea that they could somehow conquer Mexico or Cuba or whatever just doesn't seem realistic. That he would really have created, by their secession, they are admitting they're in a defensive posture, and they're just going to be, hanging on for dear life, and how long they could possibly hang on is not very clear.
Yeah, I mean, that might be true, although it might depend on foreign affairs and whether the Confederacy is recognized by other nations and so on, and how prepared they are to become a military power. But in a way, none of that matters because, just to go back again to Lincoln's duty, there is no constitutional right of secession, which is what the Southerners were claiming. And Lincoln believed that to admit that would be that really would be the disintegration of popular government, of the experiment in self-government. So I think for him, everything hinges on that fact. So long as there is no constitutional right of secession, that if what this is the invalidation of a perfectly legitimate election. And just because one faction is unhappy with the results of that election, you cannot admit that principle. That is a principle that is destructive of constitutional government. That great passage from the first inaugural, where Lincoln says that the essence of this secession argument, is anarchy. Yeah, Harvey's got a question here.
I have a question going back to the religious point that was first brought up by Lorraine Pangle. And so in making the contrast between God's punishing harshness and Lincoln's proposal of humility, or arguments for humility. And I wonder what exactly the North was guilty of. If you can always say that taking your oath after you've been elected to office, that's an oath to God, as heard by. To put the Union first is going to trump any sort of moral disgust that you feel at the presence of slavery. If it's a statesmanlike thing to put the Union first, that seems always to call for compromise. And one wonders where or at what point the North was obliged, had the duty to go to war in order to abolish slavery. And so when would that happen? And yet God doesn't seem to want to accept this excuse. That's what Lincoln is saying, that the compromises that the North lived by up to that point were wrong, and almost as wrong or as wrong as slavery itself.
Yeah,
and it's funny. Let me
yeah, okay, go ahead.
One other point about then usually philosophers or statesman-like people deplore the notion of jealous or punishing God, and so they think that people take a risk when they appeal to divine punishment, just for the reason that Lincoln gives, that they tend to put God on their own side and to think that God prefers them. So that there's a big danger in, for human reason, for human peace, in a punishing God.
Yeah, maybe the last part first. Yeah, I think Lincoln is aware of the riskiness of that appeal, and that is why he shrouds it the way he does, right? As a supposition, not as certain knowledge. So I think he is trying to protect himself against that kind of religious fanaticism. That's what I mean by doing religion differently. I mean that that might not obviate the risk entirely, but I think he thinks it moves in that direction. But on the point about statesmanship, I think it's important to stress that for Lincoln, the Union is itself a moral project. In other words, the Union has moral content. If you go back to the Gettysburg Address, the description there of this nation is, conceived in liberty, dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. So there is that principled foundation for the Union. So yes, he is willing to compromise, and he understood that the founders had compromised, but they had compromised with a kind of necessity. They had compromised with the long-standing existence of an unjust practice. And they were required to do that in order to found the Union. But I think that Lincoln believes they did not compromise with respect to the wrongness of slavery. In other words, they compromised with slavery, but they did not compromise with respect to its wrongness. So in other words, those accommodations with the institution that are present in the Constitution are written in such a way as not to give any moral standing to slavery. Slavery exists by positive law only, by the law of the municipalities or states. It does not exist under the Constitution. And those described are always referred to as persons. So Lincoln attached a lot of significance to the way those compromises were written, the way they were granted. And he believed, at least this is what he always says, that the founders had been successful in placing the institution in the course of ultimate extinction. So he's prepared to abide by those compromises because he thinks that they are precisely morally defensible. So, I mean, he does make clear that if we were to reach the point where the Union no longer had moral content, which he thinks is what would happen if we go with Stephen Douglass's popular sovereignty, then you have a contentless Union. Or worse, you have a Union now dedicated to a principle, hostile to free government. And he says at that point, he'd prefer emigrating to Russia, where he could take his despotism straight and without the base alloy of hypocrisy. Jonathan, and then I think Peter has a hand again.
hold on a sec. There we go. I just have a question about the 1619,
Yeah.
because reparations with regard to the Holocaust were not intended to be reparations for all Jews any more than Japanese internment during the Second World War was not intended to have reparations for all Japanese Americans. But this is different, right? Isn't it different in the sense that even though there's this kind of conflict at the moment between a journalist at the New York Times and well-established historians disagreeing over the different kinds of characterizations, isn't Lincoln's, I hadn't realized in the second inaugural that Lincoln had already laid out the awareness that 1619 or 1620 represents right up to our present moment. If you're reading that inaugural address in the way that I think you're intending, that there's still a lot of work to do. And I was just curious how you see that not being a real conflict between well-established historians and a journalist, but rather two ships at the moment passing in the night and not really coming to terms with what that Lincoln's observation really means.
Yeah, Jonathan, can you say just a little bit more? I'm not quite sure what the question is. I mean, I'd be happy to talk about what I think are some of the differences between today's 1619 project and Lincoln's.
That would be fine.
The way in which Lincoln's, I mean, the way I characterized it is that Lincoln's is the original and better 1619 project. So, I mean, maybe the two main differences would be that Lincoln is a better historian. So, as I'm sure you're aware, the current 1619 project argues that basically American history is all of a piece. It begins in 1619, and that 1776 is just white nationalism at work, right? It's just more white supremacy. That 1787, the Constitution, is just an attempt on the part of slaveholders to put the power of the federal government at their disposal for the maintenance of slavery. And even 1865, the 13th Amendment, right? The 1619 project reads that not as the end of slavery, but as the beginning of the carceral state. Right? Because there is an exception, of course, made that, you know, criminal justice can still continue, and the involuntary, you know, putting of people in jail is allowed under the 13th Amendment. They read that to mean that's just the beginning of a different way, you know, of assaulting the Black body. So I think Lincoln is a better historian in that he understands that the spirit of 1619 is the opposite of the spirit of 1776 and the spirit of 1787. So Lincoln understands our history as the struggle between these two spirits. And he believes that the culmination actually of 1619 is the Confederate Constitution of 1861. If you want to see what the culmination of the project of white supremacy looks like, you just have to take a look at that Confederate Constitution. So I think Lincoln is a better historian, and he is also a better psychologist. So, and you see the way that works in this speech, that he is aware of what these sort of the passionate obstacles are to true atonement and you know, a true building of a civic community, and he's trying to find a way to address those. So I think it's the opposite of the incredible divisiveness of today's 1619 project. So what that would mean then, if we could somehow return to the spirit of Lincoln, what would it mean for today? Well, I do think we would have to look seriously at the condition of the least among us. And what should be done there. I don't think it necessarily means more funneling of money, of reparations. I mean, you could say the one thing you could learn from Lincoln is that an economic solution is completely inadequate. And so I guess I would say that some of what is being done in much smaller settings does seem to me very helpful. So there are churches, for instance. There's a church in Baltimore that has found out its own rather discreditable past in slavery times. And they're now kind of building bridges to the immediately adjacent community around them, the Black community there. Or you have these, instances where people find out, they're related to each other. Supposed whites and supposed Blacks are, related to each other. So that kind of activity is very salutary. And I do think that's going forward in many respects. And sometimes by other institutions, educational institutions, Johns Hopkins and so on. Yeah, Peter?
This is just a minor following up on Harvey Mansfield's question a minute ago about what was the complicity of the North? Did Lincoln mean only the accommodation of slavery? Just the obvious point that there was slavery in the northern states. I've got a couple of dates on the big states. Pennsylvania was first to abolish 1780.
Yeah.
Massachusetts soon after, New Jersey 1804, New York 1827. So obviously it was never comparable to what came into existence in the southern states, but the slavery had existed, throughout the country at some point.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's true. You could raise questions about that answer that he gives, right? Is it actually just for God to punish in this way? Hundreds of thousands of non-slaveholders died in the conflict, right? All the Union dead were non-slaveholders. Many of them were determined foes of slavery. There were large numbers of recent freedmen, right? Blacks who died fighting for the Union. Even most of the Southern deaths were of non-slaveholders. Remember, the slaveholding population was very tiny by this point. Slaveholding had become more and more concentrated in the hands of a few. So, I mean, you could argue that all of those poor white Southerners who fought for the Confederacy, I mean, they were just as much the victims of the oligarchic slaveocracy of the South as the slaves were. So, I do think you could you can kind of push back. Is this just or not? You could also raise a question about generational fairness, right? In what sense was the war the just deserts, the woe due to that particular generation of white Americans, right? What about all of those previous generations that apparently got off scot-free? Is collective guilt a just concept? Now, Lincoln, remember, doesn't actually assert it to be just. He floats the interpretation of the war as a hypothesis and a question. Now, I do think that he believes that many Christians will be inclined to accept the interpretation as true, that it does accord with the attributes that the believers in a living God always ascribe to him. Yes, so I mean, I think that's the best I can do on that. Maybe also, I mean, there might be a sense in which, according to Lincoln, the founders put slavery in the course of ultimate extinction. If later generations behaved in a way that interfered with that, that departed from it. Then there were plenty of Northerners who were complicit in doing that. Yeah, Jean. You're on mute.
Thank you. I was just thinking of Tocqueville in this respect. If you want to raise the question of Northern complicity in this, because it's not, you have to, I think, separate two issues. And one is slavery. And yes, the North emancipated its slaves and sent them south because they were inconvenient. And they made it very difficult for those who remained to feel welcome there. And Tocqueville makes it very clear that the racial prejudice actually becomes greater once you have only a few slaves and or emancipated slaves in the North. So you have these two related issues. One is racism, in which you can say the whole country is complicit. And then you have slavery, in which the South bears the greater part of the burden, but you can't solve the problem of how you're going to put the country back together again without in some way addressing the question of racism.
Yeah, that's right. So you can see that Lincoln is aware very early of the entanglement of slavery and race. And I think his strategy through the speeches of the 1850s is to try to pull those strands out. So he tries to defer the question of race in order to bring forth and evoke what he believes to be the strong anti-slavery sentiments, kind of natural anti-slavery sentiments that can be tapped into. The problem is that Americans are unwilling to act on those anti-slavery sentiments because of their strong anti-Black feelings. They don't know what will happen in the nation, if you emancipate the slaves. They're terrified of that. And so Lincoln has to try to disentangle those strands, to defer the question of addressing race in order to focus on the slavery problem, first things first. But now it's very clear, with emancipation having taken place, that he needs to start thinking about that racial question. And you can see him doing it in things like the public letter to Conkling, where he has this great tribute to the Black fighting men, and where he starts to show he's starting to sort of write the brief for the elective franchise. It's also the case that this word malice that appears in the final paragraph, with malice toward none, if you look at his use of that word during the presidential years and before in the 1850s, he doesn't use it a lot, but I believe it always has reference to anti-Black feeling among whites. So it's a term, I think, that for him has a particular meaning. I mean, of course, he does say with malice toward none. It's clear he doesn't want malice anywhere, right? That line where he says, "What I deal with is too great for malicious dealing." But that letter to Conkling, where he says that if there are white soldiers who don't want to fight any longer because of the issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation, he says they're going to have to live, to remember that there were some Black men willing to fight. And while they, with malice in their hearts, strove to prevent or something, the great victory, the great culmination of the war. So he uses that word malice to refer to anti-Black sentiment. And I do think this is an underappreciated aspect of the speech. Everybody's aware that somehow this is about sectional reconciliation. I don't think there's as much awareness that this speech is about racial reconciliation as well, and laying the foundation for that. More questions? We officially have about 5 minutes, but
Well, all right. And thank you, Diana Schaub, for showing us that slow reading can go with intelligence.